Good day. Today is Monday, 8th December 2025, and before I begin this program, let me remind you again to, if once you watch the program, if you decide that you've liked what you've listened to and heard, or whichever part of the program you've listened to and heard, if you like it, please remember to tick the like button in order to indicate that fact. Now, again, today's program is going to be mostly about the situation in Ukraine. I've discussed in my two most recent programs the strategic review that was carried out by the United States, but obviously, in a sense, this is a theoretical or even aspirational document. It is the situation in Ukraine which ultimately continues to shape the exact course of events that are playing out in the world and in the relations between the United States and Russia, and increasingly, I suspect, in the relations between the United States and its erstwhile European allies. Now, since when one is talking about a conflict or a war, and though the Russians refer to the fighting in the area of Ukraine as a special military operation, and Putin, by the way, over the course of his trip to India, was careful to explain that there is a major difference from a Russian point of view between a special military operation and a war. Nonetheless, and despite the fact that what is playing out in Ukraine is, from a Russian point of view, a special military operation where the Russians operate within certain strict doctrinal and perhaps legal constraints. Nonetheless, it is a war. Well, when one is discussing a war, it seems to me that the correct and proper thing to do is to keep track of military developments, and I'm going to discuss those first in today's program. The first thing to say is that last night there was another massive drone attack, apparently an exclusively drone attack this time, by drones, mostly focused, from what I can understand, again on the city of Kiev. The point is that the Russians are now pounding Ukraine every night, and have been doing so for the last couple of days. Some of these attacks take place, by the way, during the day as well. I've seen really quite spectacular drone footage of a jet-powered Duran 3 streaking across the sky. You could hear the aircraft engine, the jet engine, and, well, it was a pretty spectacular film, though I don't know in which part of Ukraine it was made or what the target of the Duran 3 drone was. And by the way, there are reports that the Duran drones are becoming more and more sophisticated all the time. There are reports now that some of these Duran drones have become, in effect, fighter drones, and that they're equipped with short-range R-60 infrared-guided air-to-air missiles. These are missiles that were developed initially by the Soviet Union in the 1970s. They are, or were at the time, the equivalent of the American Sidewinder missiles. They have been superseded by more advanced missiles, air-to-air missiles for Russian fighter jets, but they're relatively small. These missiles are relatively small. They're available in large numbers. They are still apparently sophisticated, and because they're small and light, they are the perfect equipment with which to arm specialized Duran fighter drones. And one wonders what these fighter drones are being used for. We are increasingly seeing the development of robotic war in the sky, with the Russians possessing an overwhelming and growing advantage. I remember hearing an awful lot some months ago about Ukraine interceptor drones. Well, we see that the Russians are now developing fighter drones, interceptor drones of their own. And, well, I'm not going to spend more time discussing the technical developments. But anyway, regardless, these missile and drone attacks have been taking place now on an almost nightly basis, with the Russians pounding Ukraine every night. We have not yet reached the point where the Russians strike Ukraine with 1,000 drones in a single strike. Some months ago, we were getting reports that the various factories making these Duran drones would reach a situation by the end of the year where nightly attacks with 1,000 drones would become a possibility. We haven't seen that yet, but what we are already seeing is devastating and powerful enough. And, well, to get a sense of that, there's been an announcement today that for 16 hours, right across the territory of Ukraine in December, during the period of the shortest days and of some of the greatest cold, Ukraine for 16 hours, pretty much the entire territory of Ukraine for 16 hours will be without electric power. And I've seen video footage from some Ukrainian cities blacked out now during the hours of darkness. It's an extraordinary picture. And I do wonder about the conditions of life of the people in these cities. One does occasionally see light in some windows. People perhaps have their own private generators, and I suspect in apartment buildings, the big apartment buildings, private generators can also function. But though I'm not an expert in these matters, I assume that even generators need power to be provided to them so that they can store that power and then emit it. If the entire energy complex starts to break down, that might become sporadic too, and that might also affect the work of the generators as well. Anyway, what I am seeing is extraordinary and harrowing enough, and of course it is taking place now in winter. Now, back in 2022, when the Russians first began their missile strikes against the Ukrainian energy system, though on a much smaller and less sophisticated scale than what we're seeing today, I remember that reports circulated that the situation in Kiev had become so bad that the Ukrainian authorities were giving serious thought to evacuating the entire population. I have to say that I was skeptical about those reports at the time. I did wonder whether all of those dramatic claims were being made mostly to impress the West and to get the West to supply Patriot surface-to-air missiles to Ukraine, which is very much, as I remember, the topic of discussion at the time. Well, the situation in Kiev and in other Ukrainian cities today is much, much worse. And I notice that so far there is no word from the Ukrainian authorities about evacuating the civilian populations from these cities, and no commentary to that effect anywhere in the media in the West. Sometimes I find that being afflicted, as I am, with a long memory, can be, difficult for me, maybe on occasion inconvenient for some other people, but I do remember that commentary, about evacuating the populations from Kiev and elsewhere back in 2022, 2023, and I can't help but notice that in much worse conditions, that commentary, that discussion, all of that talk isn't appearing this time. Anyway, 16 hours without electric power, without heat and light. I have to say that it is terrible for me to read and hear about these things, but to repeat again, if for 16 hours there is no electric power and no heating, put aside the effect this must be having on the civilian population, surely no industrial economy can function in these conditions. And though obviously one assumes that these 16-hour periods without electric power and heat can only last for a certain period of time before some amounts of power are restored, and allowing for the fact that factories and workshops will probably have their own generators, I can't help but think that these attacks must nonetheless be having a devastating impact on the Ukrainian economy. And, well, I don't have any doubt about that. Anyway, that was one thing that was happening. But the situation on the front lines continues, and it continues to get worse and worse for Ukraine by the day and by the hour. And the last 24 hours for Ukraine have continued to be very difficult. Maybe we haven't had catastrophic news like the news we had last week about the fall of Pokrovsk, for example, but the news continues to be very bad, and of course the bad news comes on top of the very bad news that there was before. Now, this morning there are reports circulating all across the Russian media sphere that the town of Steppnorsk has fallen. Steppnorsk is a heavily fortified town made up mostly, apparently, of high-rise buildings. Some people have compared it to Ugledar. It is located south of the city of Zaporia, about 20 kilometers south of the city of Zaporia, to be precise. You could almost call it an outlying suburb. Anyway, it had been heavily fortified by the Ukrainians as part of the outward defences of the city of Zaporia. The word that had come out a couple of days ago, including, by the way, from the Russian Defense Ministry and the General Staff, the situation in Steppnorsk formed part of the report that Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, gave to Putin at a recent conference that Putin attended with military commanders, which I discussed on this channel. Anyway, the last word that we heard about Steppnorsk was that the Russians had surrounded the remaining Ukrainian troops there who were holding out in the main fortified area at the center of the town. And Redovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, was more specific. It said that the Ukrainians were still holding out in the building of the city administration in the main central square of Steppnorsk, and were still in control of some of the buildings, some of the big buildings around the clustered around the administration building, but that this was all that remained of Steppnorsk still under Ukrainian control. Well, according to the reports that we're getting on the internet, which I suspect originate with some of the soldiers, the Russian soldiers, in Steppnorsk. This territory, previously under Ukrainian control, has now been cleared. The Ukrainian defenders, however many they were, have been defeated. Probably some of them are dead. I'd like to believe that some of them have been captured and have surrendered, but of course I don't know. But anyway, the reports are that this territory has now been captured and that the whole of Steppnorsk is therefore under Russian control. Now, this is an important development because with Steppnorsk being located 20 kilometers south of the city of Zaporia, it means that Zaporia is now well within reach of Russian medium-range drones. The Rubicon group and the other drone operators of the Russian army can take up positions in Steppnorsk, and they can launch their drones from there, and they can begin attacks on Ukrainian troops in Zaporia city, and perhaps even more importantly, on the roads from Zaporia city that lead eastwards to the other Ukrainian positions in Zaporia region where the Ukrainians are still defending. So anyway, this is still unconfirmed news. There's been no word yet from the Russian Defense Ministry, but we're likely to receive it fairly soon. There are also reports that a significant area of territory in the fields, in the open steppe, between Steppnorsk and Orechov has now been occupied by the Russian army, which, if true, would mean that the Russians are now starting to take positions to the west of Orechov, the central town in Zaporia region, the linchpin of the Ukrainian defense system in Zaporia, the town from which Ukraine's own 2023 summer offensive intended to break through to the Black Sea and to isolate and ultimately encircle Crimea was launched. That offensive, of course, was comprehensively defeated by the Russians and ended in comprehensive failure. But anyway, the Russians seem to be in the process of establishing positions between Steppnorsk, which apparently they now control, and Orechov, and all of that points to a prospective siege of Orechov starting fairly soon. Now, all of that is dramatic, if true, but it is not yet confirmed. However, the next piece of news, which comes from the Russian Defense Ministry, should be treated as confirmed and as authoritative. The Russian Defense Ministry reported this morning. Units of the Dnieper group of forces have liberated Novo Danilovka, Zaporia region. Now, group of forces Dnieper, which as far as I know is still commanded by General Templinsky, the head of the Russian airborne forces and one of Russia's most talented military commanders. Anyway, that's the group of forces that has apparently captured Steppnorsk and which is now in control of the fields between Steppnorsk and Orechov, and they are also the people who have captured Novo Danilovka. Now, Novo Danilovka is an important place because it lies immediately to the south of Orechov. Now, just to the east of Novo Danilovka is the other village of Malaya Tokmachka, which group of forces Dnieper also captured about a week ago. Now, the two villages that lie to the south and east of Orechov, Novo Danilovka and Malaya Tokmachka, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, are under Russian control. And by the way, I should say straight away that I have absolutely no doubt that the Russians do indeed control these two villages. So we can see that the Russians are starting to prepare for the siege and battle for the town of Orechov. Now, further east of Orechov, east of these two places, Malaya Tokmachka and Novo Danilovka, is the town of Gulyapolye. There is apparently intense fighting taking place in Gulyapolye. Some reports say that the Russians have not yet crossed the Ganchur River in Gulyapolye, but there is lots of footage of the Russian Air Force now bombing Ukrainian positions in Gulyapolye, and that is always a sign that an attack on the Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Ganchur River, which flows through Gulyapolye, is being prepared. I'm going to guess that that will happen within the next couple of days. Now, when that, of course, happens, when we get into a situation when Gulyapolye comes under Russian control, well, then the Russians can advance eastwards and join up with group of forces, can advance westwards from Gulyapolye. They can join up with group of forces Dnieper, which has taken up positions to the south and east of Gulyapolye and the west, and we will have the encirclement of Gulyapolye and of Orechov, rather, I should say. And Orechov itself, if it is surrounded in that way, cannot be defended for very long. So we see that the collapse of the Ukrainian positions in Gulyapolye, in Zaporizhia region, continues. And, well, I'm not going to say that this is the most important area of the war, but it is nonetheless a very important one. Because, of course, if Orechov is captured, that only leaves Zaporizhia city as the last remaining big Ukrainian city, in fact, by far the most important city that the Ukrainians would control in Zaporizhia region. And, of course, the fall of Zaporizhia, the city of Zaporizhia, located on the east bank of the Dnieper, would apparently, in that case, be a relatively straightforward thing for the Russians to achieve, because if the city is surrounded on the land, supplies would have to come across the Dnieper by bridge, and that would be extraordinarily difficult to sustain. And if Zaporizhia city falls, well, the Russians will have captured one of Ukraine's biggest industrial centers, the place where motor vehicles and gas turbines and jet engines used to be produced, where many scientific institutions and laboratories and workshops were located. And still more important than that, the Russians would have gained control of territory on the east bank of the Dnieper River in central Ukraine. And I have already discussed in many programs and in many places how that would be a terminal blow for Ukraine. It would be a mortal blow from which it's difficult to imagine that Ukraine could recover. So anyway, that is the situation in Zaporizhia region. We are we seem to be looking at a slow motion collapse of Ukrainian resistance there as the Russians concentrate more and more of their forces in Zaporia region. We are also getting more reports now from the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd area. And I said in a recent program that judging by the commentaries that are starting to come from the Russian Defense Ministry, it is increasingly looking as if Ukrainian resistance in Mirnograd is beginning to collapse, and that the cauldron where 1,000 Ukrainian troops, according to the German newspaper Bild Zeitung, are trapped is now in its final days. Well, there's now been video footage. It shows Russian soldiers, not just in southern, but also central Mirnograd. And it looks as if the Russians are now closing in on the area of high-rise buildings and industrial buildings in central Mirnograd, northern Mirnograd rather, where the Ukrainians are still positioned. And again, there is heavy bombing by the Russian Air Force of the Ukrainian forces in precisely this area. Bombing carried out not just by the ordinary run-of-the-mill FAB bombs, the FAB 500s and the FAB 1500s, but apparently some of the bombing is being carried out by these immense FAB 3000 bombs, which obviously would have devastating effect on the industrial buildings and the high-rise residential buildings where the Ukrainian defenders in Mirnograd are still located. Anyway, so the Russians are closing in there, and I discussed, I think it was yesterday, that the Russians are now saying that they've captured the village of Rivne in the middle, within the territory of the cauldron. And my own view is that this cauldron now is actually very small. I think that much of the territory that the mapping projects still show as grey zone or contested is actually under tight Russian control by now. And the situation, anyway, for the Ukrainian troops in this territory looks to me to be very bad. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry is still reporting fighting in Mirnograd. It says that in Mirnograd, assault detachments of the 51st Army continue to eliminate encircled enemy formations in the Vostochny and Zapadny districts. So there's still resistance there. But I am going to say straight away that everything points to this resistance coming to an end. The Ukrainian troops, by their own account, the account they've given to Bild Zeitung, are only being supplied by drone. Not enough supplies are getting through. They're even running short of food. And of course, the smaller the cauldron becomes, the more easy it becomes for the Russians to intercept the drones that are sending these supplies. And I suspect that that is increasingly happening also. So I'm going to make a guess, perhaps a couple of days, a week at most, and Mirnograd will have been cleared. Now, north of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, the Russians continue to consolidate their positions. The Russian Defense Ministry, as I discussed yesterday, is talking of mopping up Grishino, and I get the sense that precisely this is what is happening. I think that within the next couple of days, we're going to learn that Grishino is under Russian control. And the Ukrainians have themselves produced drone footage showing Russian troops in Rodinska, immediately to the north of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. And it does look as if the Russians are in control of practically all of Rodinska. I expect that within a few days, the Russian Defense Ministry will announce that Rodinska is indeed under complete Russian control. General Syrsky, the Ukrainian overall military commander, has conducted various counterattacks against the Russians in the Pokrovsk area. Back in August, he tried to roll back the Russian breakthrough to the northeast of Pokrovsk. He burnt up a large proportion of Ukraine's army, many of its best brigades, in these counterattacks, which ultimately achieved nothing. He also launched multiple counterattacks from Grishino to try to create corridors to either supply or evacuate the Ukrainian troops who had been trapped in Mirnograd. General Budanov, the Ukrainian military intelligence chief, sent special forces there by helicopter, apparently intending to achieve the same thing. All that has achieved is that it's burnt up more of Ukraine's resources, more of its best troops, many of its best brigades. As I said in my program yesterday, the roads in this area are littered with destroyed Ukrainian equipment. But it does seem as if these Ukrainian counterattacks have now ended. The Ukrainians seem to understand that they have conclusively lost Pokrovsk and they are abandoning their troops in Mirnograd to their fate. There is no possibility now of evacuating or resupplying them, but the instructions from Kiev continue to be to these troops that they must not surrender, that they must go on fighting. Anyway, that's the situation in Pokrovsk, Mirnograd. Now, we've had more news from the area of Constantinovka, the other big town located to the east of Mirnograd and Pokrovsk. And the Russians now have strong positions to the east of Constantinovka. They have captured positions to the east of Mirnograd, places like Popovka and Rusin Yar. And obviously they are also in the process, or it seems that they're in the process, of capturing the villages of Shakhova and Sofeevka and other villages in that area, all of which would put them in strong positions to advance eastwards to cut off Constantinovka's supplies from the north. But the Russians have also now been advancing towards Constantinovka from the east. Some days ago, they announced that they had captured a cluster of villages northeast of Constantinovka, and today they've announced that they've captured another village northeast of Constantinovka, an important village called Chernovoye. And Chernovoye, incidentally, is located to the west of Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians made all kinds of claims a couple of days ago, or about a week ago, that they'd mounted a successful counterattack and had reoccupied part of Chasiv Yar. I didn't take those claims seriously. On the contrary, it looks as if it is the Russians who are not only firmly in control of Chasiv Yar, but who are now advancing eastwards from Chasiv Yar. And they've now captured Chervonoye, and they already control Klinove and other villages in this area, and it looks to me as if the Russians are now creating pincers, preparing to encircle Constantinovka, town of about 70,000 people before the war, bigger than Pokrovsk. And that process appears to be accelerating. And this, even as we've learnt that the Russians continue to advance in southern Constantinovka. The last word was that they control around a third of Constantinovka, the southern parts, the southern third of Constantinovka. Perhaps it's increased beyond that. Well, who knows? But another cauldron is forming, and it's still got some weeks to develop. But if the Ukrainians continue to defend or try to hold out in Constantinovka for much longer, then, well, we're going to see a repeat of what has happened in Mirnograd and Pokrovsk. Now, just to get a sense, by the way, of how unreal much of the information that is coming from Ukraine, to my mind, is apparently over the last 24 hours, the Ukrainians finally acknowledged that the territory south of the Kliban-Beek reservoir, which lies well to the south of Constantinovka, that this territory has finally passed under Russian control. The Russians claim, and I have no doubt that they were telling the truth, that they cleared this territory at least 6 weeks ago. But it is only now that the Ukrainians have acknowledged the truth of that, even as there is now abundant video footage which confirms that the Russians are in secure control of territory to the north within the town of Constantinovka itself. Anyway, let's put all that aside. So, a worsening picture. Now, a lot of things are happening in other places. I said yesterday that the Russians are claiming that they've that they've captured important villages in the Kupiansk area, suggesting that the cauldron there is in the process of collapsing, that Siversk now definitely appears to be in a cauldron, and probably before long Liman will be also. So lots of things are happening elsewhere in the battlefronts, but the key thing to understand is that the Russians continue to advance. Zaporizhia, not just one town like Gulyapolye, but the whole region seems to be, resistance there seems to be collapsing. One of the most fertile regions of Ukraine, by the way, and a very historic one. But Zaporizhia region is collapsing with clear trends that most of it, all of it in fact, outside the city of Zaporizhia itself will be under Russian control within a few months. And the Donbass line continues to crumble. Pokrovsk has fallen. Mirnograd is about to fall. Constantinovka is on the brink of being surrounded, and much of it is under Russian control already. Liman and Siversk is already surrounded and is crumbling as well. Liman is also being fought over. The Russians control Kupiansk. The Ukrainians have been defeated east of Kupiansk. The Donbass line is continuing to crumble, and the Ukrainian army suffering huge losses, afflicted by desertions, increasingly demoralized. fighting on behalf of a country whose economy is collapsing, and which goes through periods with only 8 hours of electricity being provided in any particular day. Well, Ukraine, its ability to resist these constant hammer blows on the ground and from the sky, its ability to continue resisting is crumbling. Now, I discussed this all at some length because obviously it's important when one is talking about a war to actually talk about the war itself. But I want to again address certain important viewpoints that one continues to see. There is a line of argument, and I've seen several articles make it, which say that the 28-point proposal, if you want to call it a proposal, that comes from Donald Trump and his team, and which, by the way, the Russians have already said is unacceptable in its current form. Anyway, the 28-point plan, several well-intentioned people are saying, well, it's not ideal for Ukraine, but it's the best Ukraine can get. Ukraine needs to make messy compromises in order to end the war, and the time has come to face up to the need to make these messy compromises. Now, that is true up to a point, but it's true up to a very limited point, because it is not Ukraine's decision ultimately whether or not the war ends. Increasingly now, obviously now, it is Russia's. The Russians are advancing. The Russians are now within sight of capturing Donbass. Again, I think that there is a great deal of unrealistic commentary about this. It's been said that because the Russians took a year and a half to capture Pokrovsk, which, by the way, isn't true. As I said, the Battle of Pokrovsk began in August. It did not begin a year and a half ago. But because the Russians took them a year and a half to capture Pokrovsk, it will take them at least a year, perhaps longer, before they get the whole of Donbass. Their advance is still incremental. They're still losing large numbers of men every day, all of that kind of thing. The reality is that already we see the pace of Russian advances, Russian acquisitions accelerate. Kupiansk, Pokrovsk have fallen. Constantinovka, very likely to fall very soon. Siversk, Lima, falling as well. Gulyapolye, likely to fall within perhaps a week, 2 weeks. Orechov, threatened. Steppnorsk, perhaps fallen today. All of it. What we're starting to see is a situation where, with Ukrainian ability to defend ebbing, and with the Russians, their military power increasing, and with more and more places falling, the remaining places that are still under Ukrainian control are at risk of falling themselves like a row of dominoes. So the fall of Pokrovsk is going to lead relatively quickly to the fall of Constantinovka. The fall of Constantinovka and the surrounding towns, Druzhivka, Kindrativka, Alexeyevo, Druzhivka, or Sikovia, will then lead to the encirclement of Kramatorsk, the biggest town still under Ukrainian control in Donbass, the fall of Siversk, Liman, Kupiansk, ultimately, and before long, no doubt, Izium too, will lead to the fall of Slavyansk. The fall of Kramatorsk will also open the way for the fall of Slavyansk. Unless people are very careful, unless they prepare themselves for this, they will find that the collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Donbass and perhaps in Zaporizhia region also has happened before they are prepared for it, when they have not expected it. A lot of this talk about Ukraine making messy compromises, the way it's written, really applies to the situation as it existed a year ago, or perhaps 6 months ago. A lot of this commentary lacks the sense of urgency that I think the current situation requires. Very few people have seen it. Roger Boys in the London Times is one. He doubted whether Ukraine would be able to keep going beyond the spring. I personally think, at the rate things are playing out, that he might very well turn out to be right. So I do want to make this point because I suspect that what is causing a lot of people to say these things is that, well, they know presumably some of what the Russians are saying, but they still listen to what the Ukrainians are saying, and they split the difference, and they assume that by doing that, they are closer to the truth, especially as the US Defense Department tends to take the Ukrainian side, and the British Ministry of Defence absolutely takes the Ukrainian side in the reporting, as of course does the Institute for the Study of War. But of course, all of those calculations, all those assumptions about the situation on the front lines would be completely wrong if the reality is that it is the Russians who are providing the information about the objective reality, and the Ukrainians are making things up. I spoke about how the Ukrainians have claimed until just now that they still control territory to the south of the Klibanbik reservoir, when anybody who's followed the fighting closely knows that the Klibanbik reservoir and all the territory, both to the south and, by the way, to the north of it, has been under Russian control for some time now. Articles continue to appear which talk about Pokrovsk falling, but Pokrovsk, the reality is, Pokrovsk has already fallen, and we have abundant evidence which confirms it. And Bild Zeitung went out of its way to confirm that evidence and found out that it was really true. And, well, you could say the same about many other places along the battlefronts. I'm confident this is also true about the situation in Kupiansk, for example. So, splitting the difference between what is real, which is what the Russians say, and what is not real, which is what the Ukrainians say, and assuming that what you're getting in the middle brings you closer to the truth, is obviously entirely the wrong methodology to follow. And, well, we can see here how this Ukrainian tendency to deny Russian advances is now, in a sense, playing against Ukraine's interests. I've said many times, and by the way, I repeat, and I don't take this back, the propaganda is a part of war. And the Ukrainians have been very good at it, and that is not something that inherently they should be criticized for. But one can see now how they are becoming the victims of their own propaganda. Because if their public believes that the situation on the front lines is much better than it really is, if the media commentariat in the West believes the same thing, if Western governments are basing their assumptions on entirely wrong information, factually wrong information that they're being given by the Ukrainians, then of course they're going to take a much more relaxed view about the situation and about Ukraine's prospects than is justified by the facts on the ground, and they are going to assume that they have more time and space within which to maneuver than they actually do. And at that point, when things start to fall apart visibly, I can very well see how how Western governments, not to mention, of course, the Ukrainian government, are themselves going to be caught flat-footed with no plan and no strategy to deal with the situation that they have. Negotiating now about ending the conflict in Ukraine needs to understand that in Donbass, in Zaporia region, the time is played out in weeks, months at most. Thinking that you have a whole year to play with is completely misguided. You do not have that amount of time. Time for Ukraine is running out. 16 hours without electricity should make that obvious. And I do wonder what the Western embassies in Kiev, they of course will have power because they will have emergency generators, what the people in these embassies are reporting about all of this to their capitals in the West. Anyway, that now brings me to the diplomacy. So we now have, again, the Ukrainians meeting with the Americans in Florida. I've already said that that meeting doesn't appear to have gone especially well, or rather, it doesn't seem to have gone well at all. We've heard about a tense meeting. This was the latest in the series of meetings. Zelensky, who has been trying to meet Trump and to speak to Trump, was palmed off by the Americans with a 2-hour telephone call with Witkoff instead. By the way, Trump's refusal to meet Zelensky, I think, represents an acknowledgement by Trump that nothing good ever comes of his meeting or having direct discussions with Zelensky. When he met with Zelensky in the Oval Office back in February of this year, it ended in a public row, and though it was Zelensky who, in my opinion, quite intentionally provoked the row, I discussed it all thoroughly at the time, and I anticipated before the meeting in the Oval Office in February happened that Zelensky was coming to the meeting absolutely in the mood to start a row. Anyway, despite the fact that it was Zelensky who started the row, of course, the Europeans, the media in Europe and in the United States blamed Donald Trump. So Trump has been anxious to avoid any appearance of a row like that again. He doesn't want to be blamed for trying to bully Zelensky. So, of course, after he met with Putin in Anchorage and he had his understanding, he came to his understanding with Putin as to the way forward. The Europeans came along and Zelensky came along and they all met Trump in the White House, though not in the Oval Office. And again, Trump, anxious to avoid a row, retreated from the understandings that he'd reached with Putin in Anchorage and appeared to fall back on the Kellogg plan, the ceasefire, on the existing conflict lines. And, well, months were then wasted with no movement at all in the diplomacy, months in which Ukraine's situation continued to go from bad to worse, and then Putin and Trump spoke over the telephone again, and Trump seems to have promised Putin that this time round, when he was due to meet Zelensky again in the White House on the following day, this time he would stand his ground and he would get Zelensky to change his course. And they did meet, and the meeting took place in private, and apparently there were raised voices, and Trump was furious, but again, he didn't want to publicly fall out with Zelensky. So again, we were back to the Kellogg plan, the ceasefire on the existing conflict lines, all the things that the Russians have rejected. So Trump now seems to have understood that it is not in his interests, at least he seems to have understood for the time being, that it is not in his interests to talk directly to Zelensky or to meet with Zelensky. So instead, it's left to Witkoff to conduct the calls. And apparently it was a call that lasted for 2 hours, and it went horribly wrong because Zelensky did that which he always does. He rejected everything. We're told, Zelensky himself has told us that he rejected outright any suggestions of land swaps, any suggestions of withdrawals from Donbass. I said in my program yesterday that the Europeans would tell Zelensky to reject any withdrawal from Donbass. And of course, Zelensky is delighted and happy to do that because Zelensky wants to reject the idea of a withdrawal from Donbass, and that's what he did. And Zelensky also apparently pressed Witkoff about what happens when peace is declared, what are the security guarantees that Ukraine will receive after peace is declared. And again, it's not difficult to work out if you follow and track Zelensky's thinking and his wording carefully, that he wants security guarantees from the United States that are so strong that they ultimately commit the United States to defending Ukraine, and which will be a pathway for eventual Ukrainian entry into NATO. So Zelensky, in this difficult, and even Zelensky admits it was a difficult 2-hour call, gave no ground at all. And Trump himself has expressed disappointment. He said that he's disappointed. He says that he gets the impression that Zelensky has not read any part of the peace plan, the Trump peace plan. I presume this means the 28 points, which of course the Russians themselves have also said are not acceptable in their present form. But anyway, the Americans appear to have told the Russians that they will sort out some kind of negotiating team to work with the Russians on these 28 points once they get Ukrainian agreement to them. Trump promised Putin way back in August during the meeting in Anchorage that he would get the Ukrainians to accept surrender of territory and Russian occupation of territory and de facto recognition of Russian control of territory and Ukraine outside NATO and limitations on the side of the Ukrainian armed forces. Trump apparently promised Putin that he would manage to get Zelensky to agree to all of these things, at least in principle, but he has not been able to. And, well, the way things stand is that the substantive negotiations between the United States and Russia cannot proceed, apparently, until that happens, because politically, I suppose, Trump needs to be able to tell people in the United States, the neocons, the deep state, all of those people, Lindsey Graham, that they shouldn't really criticize him because he's got the Ukrainians to agree to everything that he wants to do. Anyway, so Zelensky is saying no. And Trump is frustrated. He is disappointed. But of course, if you've been listening to these programs, if you've been listening to what we've been saying on the Duran, if you've been listening to what many others have been saying over the last couple of months, he would know that there's no occasion to be disappointed because, of course, Zelensky absolutely does not want to see the war end. Obviously not. And nor do the Europeans. And Zelensky is now in London. And his dear friend, Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of Great Britain, was there to receive him. Zelensky may be drowning in a massive corruption scandal in Kiev. There may be stories about golden toilets affecting or concerning members of his own entourage. One of his closest allies has had to flee to Israel with the investigators in hot pursuit. He might have had to drop his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak. There's an instruction that Yermak should not leave the territory of Ukraine, but Yermak has given a clear indication of the fact that he continues to be a major power broker in Ukraine. He rolled up to the headquarters of Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, another one of the alphabet soup of Ukrainian intelligence and security agencies. Anyway, he rolled up in apparently an armoured Mercedes. I don't know whether it was armoured. Maybe that's just a story. But anyway, he rolled up in an official-looking Mercedes. He had an hour and a half of discussion with the chief of this agency, who is apparently a protege of his. And the word is that this person, this agency, is now going to arrange for Yermak's flight from Ukraine so that the investigators won't be able to reach him. Yermak, of course, was telling us a couple of days ago that he was going to go to the front to fight there. He doesn't seem to be in any hurry to do it. Just saying. Anyway, so amidst all of this enormous scandal that's playing out in Ukraine, at a time when the Ukrainian people in the middle of winter are for 16 hours a day without electric power, their leader, President Zelensky, comes to London and he is hugged again outside Downing Street. You can see the pictures all over the media here in Britain. He's hugged again. He's embraced by his dear friend, the Prime Minister of Britain, Keir Starmer. And it really is astonishing. One wonders how bad the situation in Ukraine has to be. One wonders how bad the information about Zelensky himself has to be before Keir Starmer does that. Incidentally, just to say, Starmer's position in Britain, after a brief stabilisation after the budget, continues to decline. There are now rumours that two of his rivals within the British Labour Party, Wes Streeting and Angela Rayner are having soundings with each other about them working together to oust Starmer and to take his place. As those of you who watch these programs know, I was travelling out of London. I was in Oxford, but I was also travelling around, driving around the English countryside north of London in order to get to Oxford, and even more to return from Oxford. I should say I wasn't only in Oxford during the period of this weekend stay. I actually had to, I went to visit someone, I can't say who, in a small town, a small village more likely, outside Oxford. So that gave me a great sense of the state of the English countryside. I saw signs reflecting the public mood in these places. I'm not going to say too much about it because I've discussed it at length in a program that we've done on the Duran, which will come up in a few days and you can see it there. But it became absolutely clear to me that outside London, the authority of the political class in London, which is of course epitomised by Keir Starmer, is collapsing. But of course Keir Starmer doesn't care about any of that. Much more important to him is to embrace his dear friend Zelensky, put aside corruption scandals, put aside the crisis in Britain. This love between Zelensky and Starmer, it appears to have no bounds. But anyway, there we go. They're all there, not just Zelensky, but Merz is there. Merz is saying that he's skeptical about some elements of Trump's plan. I'm skeptical about some of the details which we are seeing in the documents coming from the US side, says Merz, even as he tries to basically obliterate this plan. We learn from Macron that the Europeans are aiming to find a convergence between the US, Ukrainian and European positions. I think the main issue is the convergence between our common positions, Europeans and Ukrainians, and the US, to finalize these peace negotiations. The best possible conditions for the Ukraine. The parties can then move to a new phase in which they would aim to secure the best possible conditions for Ukraine, for the Europeans, and for collective security. Which tells us again that that we're back in Eve Smith territory, if I can put it like that. The West negotiating with itself, completely losing sight that it is the Russians, not them, that is in the driving seat and which is winning the war. And, we also have reports from Keir Starmer. He's talking about the talks being at a critical stage of the push for peace. But I noticed that Starmer is still talking about a ceasefire. We stand with Ukraine. If there is to be a ceasefire, then it needs to be a just and lasting ceasefire. Then that is why it is so important we repeatedly set out the principle that matters about Ukraine are for Ukraine. We stand here to support you, that's to say Zelensky, in the conflict and support you in the negotiations. So the word ceasefire is the giveaway. Because, of course, they're not interested in the peace plan that Trump is proposing. They certainly, the 28 points that Trump is proposing. When they talk about a ceasefire and they talk about a just and lasting ceasefire, what they really mean is a freeze on the existing conflict lines. In other words, they are still working to achieve the plan first proposed by General Kellogg. He, by the way, has resurfaced. He's made a number of comments. Of course, he's playing no role, as far as I can see, in the negotiations anymore. He's not participating in these discussions in London. He's not meeting with the Ukrainians. He obviously has never met with the Russians. He's had no part, as everybody agrees, in the drafting of the 28 points or any of the other various plans that have been circulated or points that have been circulated. But he still feels able to talk about this. He says that we're in the last 100 yards or whatever it was, that these can often be the most difficult. And he did say that there's no question of any US troops on the ground in Ukraine, but everything seemed to me to suggest that he's still quietly supporting, to the extent he can, his original plan, which, to repeat again, is for a freeze of the conflict. Now, it is all completely surreal at a certain level, because the Russians have already rejected all of this. They've already said that a ceasefire, a freeze of the conflict, is unacceptable to them. They have, I think, made it perfectly clear, Putin has made it perfectly clear, that they don't just expect Donbass and Zaporia and Kherson regions to be transferred to themselves, but they're perhaps in the mood to think of more if that isn't agreed. But Zelensky is not even prepared to give up the remaining territory Ukraine still controls in Donetsk region, which is about to fall. And the Europeans are encouraging him on this. And the Europeans continue to insist that Zelensky, Ukraine, must be given a pathway, what will be, in the end, a pathway to join NATO. And when you read Keir Starmer talking about a ceasefire, it's difficult to think that he is thinking of anything other, eventually, than introducing European troops into Ukraine as part of a ceasefire, which is what Starmer and his good friend Emmanuel Macron thought about long ago. So we could see that when Macron is talking about a convergence between the American ideas, and about which Merz says that he is skeptical, and the European and Ukrainian positions, what they're really trying to do is to basically alter these American ideas so completely that they bear no relation any longer to the 28 points that were originally prepared by Witkoff and Kushner, and which were presented and partially rejected by Putin last week. So, again, I can't imagine that this negotiation is ever going to get very far. The Russians, by the way, have taken to asking the Americans. Ushakov has said this publicly. They've taken to asking, why are the Americans wasting time with these people at all? Why are the Americans even talking to the Europeans? Why do they continue to talk to Zelensky? Anyway, there it is. This is where we are with the negotiations. The Americans perhaps still not fully understanding that there isn't that much time. The Europeans showing no recognition of this fact. Zelensky still talking about great victories that his army has won in Kupiansk and in other places, oblivious to the catastrophe that is playing out on the front lines for Ukraine, and the Europeans working round the clock to reinforce him in that folly. The Europeans, by the way, seem as far away as ever from sorting out their positions on the seizure of the Russian assets. Merz, Macron, Starmer, and of course Ursula and Callas clearly want to do that, but Belgium remains strongly opposed, and one gets the sense that other countries remain opposed too. Now, the Financial Times says that even as France is prepared at least to consider Ursula's plan for the misappropriation of the Russian state assets held in Euroclear, is adamantly rejecting all suggestions that the very large amounts of money and assets, Russian assets, frozen in France and held by French banks and other financial institutions should be made available to Ukraine. The French, at least Macron, presumably under pressure from French banks who are telling him under no circumstances do this thing. If you do that, if you misappropriate these Russian assets, we are finished. He is apparently digging his heels in about that. As we see, however, he still wants the Belgians to shift ground and to allow the assets to be plundered from Euroclear. There is no sense or logic in what the Europeans any longer are trying to do. By the way, Macron was recently in China. He tried to get the Chinese to put pressure on the Russians. Xi Jinping basically told him no. And Josef Wadolf, the German foreign minister, is now in China too, and he's repeating the same message that Macron gave to the French, to the Chinese whilst he was in China. And surprise, surprise, the Chinese are giving the same message back. It does seem extraordinary again that these people seem unable to take no for an answer. Now, I have not yet discussed in detail the meeting, the visit by Putin to India. Suffice to say that it did not result in the defense agreements that many had expected, including myself, by the way. There was no word about Sukhoi 57, joint production of Sukhoi 57s and supplies of S-400 missiles. Probably that is coming. My guess is that the Indians decided that announcing all of these things would be too much for Donald Trump, and they decided that this needed to be separated from Putin's visit. Announcing it over the course of Putin's visit would have made it seem altogether too obvious that India was siding with Russia rather than with the United States. But the economic agreements were huge. And as far as I can tell, they also continued to presume continued deliveries at existing levels of Russian oil to India. So the Europeans, the Americans making no progress with the Indians, and the Europeans making no progress with the Chinese. As I said, one wonders when these people will finally take no for an answer. But all of this discussion about these plans, all of this these plans, the American plans, all of these meetings in London, I have to say this, to me at least, they have a surreal quality. All of these people meeting in the splendid conditions of Downing Street and whatever other place in London they're meeting, the Foreign Office, maybe Lancaster House, who knows where. Zelensky enjoying the warm conditions, the central heating, the wonderful lavish food, the elegant hospitality. In the meantime, people in Ukraine, in Kiev, shivering, no electric power, no heating, no light. The drones, the Russian drones come in, the missiles come in, the economy is failing, hyperinflation might very well be looming. On the front lines, hundreds of men dying, getting wounded every day, villages and towns falling. The various attempts to put pressure on the Russians, all unsuccessful. The sanctions against Russia, unsuccessful. The attempts to get the Indians and the Chinese to put the pressure on the Russians, unsuccessful. And yet, even as this collapse looms, the leaders of the West, the leaders of Europe, the leaders of Ukraine, what do? They meet, as I said, in these resplendent, comfortable conditions in London, talking about plans and ideas, all rejected, acting as if they're still relevant and important, helping to prolong a war that is already lost, extending the death agony of a nation and people. I mean, one can ridicule it, but perhaps anger and disgust is the better response. Now, the Americans have not sorted this all out. They've not sorted themselves out, not by any means, but they are at least, to some extent, more in contact with the real world, the real realities on the ground. And they do appear to understand that it is the Russians who are indeed in the driving seat, and that, well, any settlement must address their concerns. They've not yet been able to put forward proposals that do that, but at least they've moved some way to the point where the Russians can say that, well, we are prepared to work with some of this. But this obstacle presented by Europe and Ukraine, or at least the Ukrainian leadership, Zelensky and co., never goes away, and you can begin to see that some Americans are getting frustrated and losing patience. The president's son, Donald Trump Jr., gave a fiery speech in Doha. He said all sorts of things about Europe and about Ukraine and about the corruption there that seemed to be absolutely true as far as I could see. He seems to understand the realities of the war far better than all of these statesmen and politicians and leaders do, even though he has no official role in the US government. And he at least seemed willing to contemplate the possibility that his father, the president, might finally make the decision to walk away from this mess. Well, the Americans, some Americans, as I said, retain some contact with reality. The leaders of Europe lost it all long ago, and we see it continue to play out today in London. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.